most importantly, he is prolific. So those of us who like him don't have to wait too long for his books. Now, this is the introduction from the heart. Right? There is an introduction that I've been given to read, so let me read that too. Okay, Anand Nilkandan is the best-selling author of Asura, Tale of the Vanquished and the Ajaya series. His books have been translated into more than 14 languages, including Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesian. Anand has also written the screenplays of hugely popular TV series, including Siya Ke Ram, Ashoka, and Mahabali Hanuman. He writes columns in the Hindu, Indian Express, Pioneer, Washington Post, and Scroll.in. His first book in the Bahubali series, The Rise of Shivagami, was released in 2017. You can see the cover of that to the left of Anand, if you guys can see him. And the book was shortlisted for the Crossword Popular Award and received the Kalinga International Literary Award for the Best Popular Fiction in 2017. Netflix has announced a series based on the Bahubali books as well. And this, I think someone is to be on mute. Sorry. And this event is to launch on the London platform as well. His latest book, Chaturanga. This is the cover. I've just tried reading it. I absolutely love it. I would, Anand is going to take you through it in more detail, but I would strongly urge you guys to buy the book. Okay, that's the end of my introduction. The introduction of a reader and a friend. Now over to you, Sangeeta ji.
Thank you, Amish. Thank you, Prabha Khaitan Foundation. Thank you, Amish, for your wonderful introduction from your heart. We have always been a fan of each other. You are the pioneer in this. I followed closely behind after your Milwa with my Asura. So we will continue to tell. There are thousands of stories to tell. All of us should tell a lot of stories. And I'm really happy to talk to Sangeeta, a prolific filmmaker and a cultural icon. Thank you very much. And thank you, Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Nehru Center.
Thank you, Amishji, and thank you, Anand, for being here. I'm looking forward to a conversation with you. Before we go into the new book, Chaturanga, I'd just like to talk about some other concepts, because here at the Nehru Center, we are reaching out to audiences who are also not, or there could be some people who are not necessarily familiar with all of Indian mythology. So in India, of course, this very rich and ancient civilization has given us stories and is constantly giving us stories from the ancient ages, from the Puranas, from all sorts of sources which we still continue to discover. And as we were talking a little earlier, there are some stories which become the main stories, the official stories, the institutional stories, and some which then again have to be rediscovered. So I'd just like to start by putting these things in context and asking you, what do you think appeals to the younger generation, to the present millennial generation, about mythology? Why is it such a fascinating subject?
Puranas, I won't even call them mythologies, because India is a living culture. Mythology is something which has gone dead and gone, and these are all old stories. For us, we are still writing these. So these are getting on, evolving day by day. And I don't think it is not just about the youngsters of this era. Ramayana and Mahabharata and other great stories of other Indian classical languages like Tamil or Malayalam or Bengali or Odia, all these got rewritten in every generation. So every generation has found it interesting, not just this generation. We are asking this question and answering this question because we are in this generation, that's all. It is not only about books, it's about films also. When the films were coming of age, all were based on our Puranas. When the Doordarshan and the television came, then also most of our things, most of the stories are based on Puranas. Even now when they retelecast Ramanand Sagar ji's Ramayan or B.R. Chopra ji's Mahabharata, again I think it broke the world record. So it is not that generation also, when we were growing up, I grew up in that, when I was 14 or 15, these things, 13 or 14, these things came. That time also it was a big hit. Even when my children are at that age, now also it is a big hit. So it is that is a greatness of a classic. You reinvent it in every generation. But why we feel so it is very important this era is because a lot of us are writing in English, and Indian English is coming of age as a new language. It has come out of the British English or American English. It has become another language. So what happens in India, every time a language is born, the stories are taken from our Puranas. When Hindi was born in Brajabhasha, these things were born. Tulsidas ji wrote. When Bengali was coming of age, then also even during the neoclassical age of Bengali, Michael Madhusudan Datta and others wrote about Ramana Padagavya, Meghanatha Padagavya, and Kannada also, Tamil also, Telugu, Marathi. All these languages, when they were coming of age, and art form is coming of age, they go back to Puranas and tell it, these age-old tales. Now Indian English is coming of age, and that is where you can find a lot of mythology books.
Yes. It's interesting also, depending on a particular time, how we receive these stories, right? I'm sure you will also remember, and I do remember, that my first introduction to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata has been through stories that my grandmother told me. So they came as oral stories, and they came as cyclical stories. So one night I would tell her, tell me this part of the story, tell me that part of the story. So it was a fascinating way of receiving these stories, and they've stayed with us all our lives. Later on, I think there's the next generation who also grew up on Amar Chitra Katha, because there were graphic stories coming to them. And then now it's through the web series, because even here in the West, look at Game of Thrones, look at Hunger Games, all of that is bringing visual aspects to these stories to us, and they come in very large content, very heavy content. So for you, what was your introduction to these stories, to the myths, to the epics in India?
For me, like most Indians, it is through my parents rather than grandparents, because I was the youngest son. So I was born when my father was 50. So he was, and he was an expert in all these things. Mr. Neelakantan is no more now. Both my parents are not there, but both of them used to tell me all these stories. And more than that, I grew up in a place in what could be called the cultural center of Kerala. I studied in the cultural capital of Kerala also. So what happens is there are more than 108 temples in my village where I grew up. Now it is a part of Cochin city. At that time, it was the headquarters of the erstwhile Cochin Royal Kingdom. So the patronage was there. So every temple had this kind of performing arts based on our Puranas, like Kathakali, Ottanthullal, the classical dances, music, art forms, various folk dances, folk art forms coming from neighboring states also. These used to come, and this was one source of entertainment and also of gathering some knowledge. So I say, if you ask me, many of us who grew up there, these things are in our blood. These are not told, or this is not something which we researched and found out.
Right.
You exposed to various forms of Ramayana, various versions of Ramayana, various versions of Mahabharata and other tales all throughout our childhood. So it is that cultural moorings which I grew up with. I think that helped, because most of my writing is inspired by folk tales rather than the written Ramayana or Mahabharata. And folk tales are so fascinating. A.K. Ramanujan, one of the greatest scholars in this, he had aptly put, no one in India ever reads Ramayana or Mahabharata for the first time. They are born with it. It's always second hand, third hand, fourth hand reading of Ramayana or Mahabharata happens. And I doubt everyone knows the story of Ramayana and Mahabharata in India, but I don't think more than 5% would have read it in any form. Most of them have heard it or seen it.
Right.
So that's a tradition. So my moorings are from that.
And so with your books, both with Asura and the Ajaya series, you have looked at the Ramayana and you've also looked at the Mahabharata. But these are, as you have said, they are tales of the vanquished. They are tales told by the side which has been defeated. And this is a very interesting way of looking at a story, looking at it from the other side. So for instance, it always takes me back to Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan becomes the much more interesting and complex character, and you engage with that character who has lost paradise, not the person who is reigning over paradise and who is making the laws. So again, what is this interest in the defeated, or in the side which has not been able to tell their point of view or their story?
Two things. One is it's a what you call Ravan as an evil or Duryodhana as an evil. It's a very typical Bhakti era concept, a very typical Gangetic belt concept. You go to peninsular India, you go to coastal India, even including Odisha and Bengal, among the folk tradition, or you go to tribals, you find that all these characters, each character has their own sympathizers. There are temples for Duryodhan. As I said, there's a big temple for Duryodhan, Shakuni and all in Kerala. There are temples for Ravan. Even in Himachal, there is a temple for Duryodhan. So there has always been a subaltern culture in India, which always viewed every character with sympathy. Why it came like that is again because the very purpose of writing Ramayana or Mahabharata in the first place, how they evolved, it was never to tell the story of good versus evil. We never had that concept of absolute good versus absolute evil. Our concept was always of karma and karma bala. It's about, like Yajnavalkya says in his Prestige, what is life? Life is nothing but the choices you make, the actions you do on that choices, and the fruit of that action. Only three things are there with which life can be defined. So he doesn't talk about God, he doesn't talk about good, he doesn't talk about bad. Every action is mixed. There is no action which has absolute goodness in it or absolute badness in it, absolute bad things about it. The concept of what you call sin versus virtue, God versus Satan, heaven versus hell is totally alien to India, at least until it got in contact with the Abrahamic cultures or Semitic cultures. So wherever the Islamic rule had happened, I'm not talking good or bad about it, but the influence I'm talking about, the Islamic rule had happened, and then during the British era and all, our thought process also changed, and you can see the Bhakti era, which also gave us a beautiful literature, music and all, had this problem also. It accepted this kind of dualities. And then suddenly the lynching of Ravan started, Ravan was burned. So you take the map of India and see, you will find a very interesting thing. The Dasara is celebrated in different ways, is a festival celebrated across the country. But it is celebrated in different ways for different god in different parts of the country. That shows our diversity. So wherever the Islamic rule was not there, it is never about Rama and Ravan. For in Kerala, it is Saraswati Puja. It's about Vidyarambha. It's about education. It's about learning something. In Bengal and all could be, it is with Durga Puja. In parts of, some parts of the country, it is about Lakshmi Puja. So, how one festival itself became many type of festival in the same day depends on its history and culture itself. So coming from the peninsular India, coming from the southern India, especially in the coastal belt, the Kathakali and all are rich with this kind of Ravan's heroics, Bali's heroics, and all those things. So they are shown as such. In my book also, I have not made them flawless characters. They are not Maryada Purushottams. I have shown it from their angle. They are as good or as evil as anyone else. So I was just trying to bring back how the original was written, where these are all Mahapurushas, the great men with their own flaws, which even Lord Ram also has flaws. If you really see Valmiki Ramayana, Lord Ram also has flaws and he pays the price for it. He pays the karma bala of it. So does Krishna. When Krishna says the same thing and Gandhari curses him in Mahabharata, when Gandhari says that after the war, you are also going to face this. Let your Kula, let your Vamsha, let your clan also fight like this and die. Krishna accepts it. He says that, yes, that is my action I did. I did it for a purpose. I will face it. And he faces that. So when you read Ramayana or Mahabharata, they are not to be read as in what you call only as Ramayana or Mahabharata. These two have to be read as one single book. Why? Certain actions of certain characters in Ramayana, they pay the price of it in Mahabharata. Because there is no absolute end in Hinduism or in Indian thought. It's about a cycle. So the life never ends. It's on life and death. It's like day and night. The cycle continues. So when Ram kills Bali, hiding behind a tree, when you look it with a very westernized eyes, with absolute morality, then suddenly you think of questioning it. How is it right? How can Ram kill somebody? And then in bhakti mode, if you are looking at it, you try to justify it. But none of the justification are given in most of the books, in the original books. It's just an act. Ram had to take that act because at that time that was good for him. Does he pay the price? Yes, he paid the price. In the next Janma, as Krishna, the same Jara, Bali comes as Jara and kills Krishna the same way. So there is no what you call absolute good or bad, and that is what I am trying to tell through my books. And it is not that I write only from the antagonist side. I write from the side in all my television shows like Siya Ke Ram. I had written it from Sita's perspective, and Mahabali Hanuman I had written from Hanuman's perspective. So I write from all sides. What I am trying to do is to give a wholesome perspective instead of being looking at all these great tales through one glasses.
Yeah. And even with your characters, they are gray characters, as you are explaining, that there are several layers. And when we read your books and we look at these characters, there are many aspects and many layers that you can delve into. Perhaps sometimes when you go back to a book, you find another meaning or another suggestion which you didn't find the first time. But when your books get into screen, you're telling these same stories as screenplays, then in terms of technique, what changes? What are you focusing on? And I also would like to tell our audience here that you started as a cartoonist. So there is a graphic part of your mind which also is trained and worked professionally. So how does all this come together?
I think
you could have told something very concisely, a little image, and you could have told a story. But here you're using lots of words and using a whole landscape, a whole mythology, a fantasy landscape which you're creating. So they're different, aren't they, in terms of technique?
I think there are two kind of writers, not the literary and popular, the usual thing. I think it is more about the writers who depend on the visual cues and the writers who depend on the auditory sensations, what you hear. So the earlier writing, what we many a times consider as literary writing, is the one which uses beautiful words. Where does these words come from? From your part of the brain, which is used to hearing tales through poetry, because the first form of storytelling was poetry. But in the last 100 years, the storytelling changed dramatically. Drama, of course, was a visual art, but otherwise, the entire visual form of storytelling came to forefront with cinema and TV and other media. So I believe I am that kind of writer who thinks visually rather than poetically. Two reasons for that. One, English is not my base language. English is not the language which I think I have. English might be my fourth language or fifth language. So English is not even my second language. But I acquired English very late in life. I'm not a very natural English speaker. I don't think in English. I don't speak English. I don't speak English at home. So how did I break in? Because I was thinking visually. That is why it was easy for me to write for television or films. Because I think many of the directors, the prominent directors, including S.S. Rajamouli, they liked my writing because of the visual quality than the literary quality of it. Literary quality, as I said, with using beautiful words, writing poetically, and all those things. For me, my novels itself may look like a screenplay. Why? Because I don't have perhaps not enough language skills to write poetically, but I have enough visual skills. I paint, I draw. So I first seen the scene like a film in my mind, and then with my limited English knowledge, I try to put it into the book. So that worked as an advantage for me, because for 95% or 98% of the Indians, English again is a language of aspiration, but it is never the second language, or forget first language, second language, or third language. As I said, it might be the fourth language. Most Indians speak 3 or 4 languages. You will not even observe it, But if you just talk to anyone on the street, at least 3 to 4 languages, most people will handle. And English might be the 4th language. So my simple English with my high visuals is, and it's not only applicable to me, most of the writers who have been successful in the last decade, they have cut this without knowing or unknowingly. So when I'm writing screenplay, it is easier for me because what I am doing is first I think in Malayalam, then I think it in visuals, then I translate to English and write. So when I'm writing screenplay, one step is less. I can write in bad English also, it doesn't matter. I have to just give a good visual. Why? Because screenplay again is not a final product. Screenplay is just like a foundation, or not even foundation, it's like a architect's sketch, a plan for a building. So I create the visual things, and with whatever my background and my whatever stories I have heard, imbibed, I can easily convert them to screenplay. So writing novel is one step ahead for me because I had to go through the process of third translation into that. Though I have already, this is my 7th book.
Yes.
And I have written more screenplays than books. Almost 500 episodes I have written. And
so do you work with the writers team, or do you do all the work yourself?
I don't have a team.
And your research work, because a lot of research is involved in these books as well.
I am 46 now. Right from the age of 3, I might have picked up all these things. So it's a 43 years of research. So I don't need a team for that, because what happens is I work hardly 2 to 3 hours a day. The rest of the time I read or watch shows or something. So how many hours of practice is happening? And I keep not only reading, I keep watching. Earlier I used to go and watch. Now I cannot move out because of the COVID. So I watch in YouTube, I watch in various formats, video formats, and I watch folk arts. Why? Because one word somebody is telling, no, I can understand a lot of languages, even though I may not be able to speak because of the practice. So any folk art, when I am hearing it, because mostly it is based on mythology, so the Purana, so I know the story also. So even if it is told in Assamese, I can pick up because I know a bit of Sanskrit and Tamil, the 2 base languages of India. Once you know these 2 languages, most of the things you can understand. I cannot understand much of Urdu because I am not exposed to it. So Urdu poetry, and slowly I'm learning it now. But other than that, all other languages in India, if I strain hard and if it is based on Purana, I can understand. That skill somehow it has developed. I will not understand 100% perfect, but it is enough. I get 3 lines out of a 1 hour folk rendering, folk song. That can trigger a story in me easily because the thought process keeps churning. So that is my research. I don't have a team of researchers or anything for that. Rather, I work as for many of the TV shows, I work as a research guy for them. Even I not write. Sometimes everything I cannot write. I don't have time. I am in the consultancy board of some channels and some of the producers. When they are producing not only mythology but also history, I work as a research. So that is another way of how I earn my living.
So coming to the famed Bahubali prequel, you're now out with Chaturanga, which is the 2nd in the prequel. Would you like to tell our listeners why you chose to tell the story of Shivagami? There were so many characters, but why this focus on Shivagami?
2 things. One, this is an official prequel. This is a part of the Bahubali franchise. Yeah. So the director had called me, Rajamouli sir had called me, and he had read my Asura, Jaya and all, and after that he had called. So he had liked my kind of thing. So we were just exploring what could be done 4 or 5 years back when in between these 1 and 2. He told me, what will you choose? So in fact, actually he conducted a test like thing. He said whether you can write something on Bahubali world. So what I wrote was everything which had happened as a backstory of what was shown in the film. And he asked me to choose any characters. So I said that I cannot choose. I don't want to write. Easier method would have been to tell the same Bahubali, use all the Bahubali characters' name, Bahubali himself, who is the hero, and tell stories of him. That's a conventional route somebody would have taken. But for me, Bahubali was very white. there was no shades of gray in him. He was too gray. So I wanted somebody who has shades of gray because of my love for this kind of characters with a lot of what do you call layers. So I found that Shivagami is two things: a powerful woman in the medieval world. A powerful woman in the present day world itself is a tough task. Imagine a powerful woman in the medieval world where in such an oppressive atmosphere, she is rising to the power, she is the queen. How she should rise and she is the one, second thing is she is the one who orders the murder of her own adopted son, the son she loves most, the Bahubali, the hero. So she became a fascinating character for me. She has good and bad in her and she is so lifelike. So I thought that I will tell her story first. Because at that time, I had 3 books, so I wanted to write it from a female perspective also to see how it looks like. So that was a challenge. Then the other character I took was Kattappa, because again a grey character. He's noble, he's like Bhishma Pitama and all those things. But yet, when he's asked to kill, he's going and killing the one who he loves most. So these 2 characters, what made them? What were the circumstances? That's why I chose them. And then the villain, Vijal Deva, I had chosen. So what happened was in the the 30 years of the story which I am telling, I had the freedom of creating another 40 characters who are not in the film, and they are my characters.
Yeah.
They will not come to the film. Most of them had to end before the film in the story itself. So that gave me a lot of freedom. So 3 grey characters and then another 37, 38 characters with who I can play with. So I can create a great story world or a very deep story world. So that's what I have attempted to do. Because this kind of content, which again is becoming a Netflix series, so it's almost 50-60 hours of content if you go for 4-5 seasons. It needs so many characters. So thus it was created. I have used mythology, I have used history and created a proto-history or a pseudo-history for Mahishmati. I have even gone back to 3000 years of Mahishmati's history, a pseudo-history as a part of my writing. I have not used even 5% of it, but entire fictional historical world I created. Who was the first king? What was the revolution that happened? How many times it had gone under other kingdoms? When was it a smaller kingdom? When it became a bigger kingdom, the rise and fall of Second Empire, Third Empire, Fourth Empire, the kings, queens. So if required, I might not do it, but if required, you can keep churning stories out of it because the story world is so huge.
Right.
Of which only 5% has come in the book. That's only required here also because this happened 2000 years before Bahubali. That also I have written in as a part of my writing book.
As proto-history, creating this.
I think most of our history was created like this.
Yeah, so true.
Even the history what we think about is just like creation of some writers like this. Half of it is fictional or more than half of it is fictional.
Yeah. But this world that you create, Anand, the world of Mahishmati, and then you have the other world of Kadali Mandalam. So there's this, it's interesting how you have not just the main character, but a lot of women who are very powerful, they have great agency, they're very free, liberated characters. And I really wanted to know whether your origin in Kerala, where there is a matrilineal system, where women anyway have a voice and they have a cultural agency. Does that come into the story? Is that what fuels it?
Kadaramandalam is based on medieval Kerala. Most of our society is like that. So it's a coastal kingdom. It used to be prosperous. It falls under Mahishmati, which is a kingdom inside by a river side. So coastal kingdoms always have coastal kingdoms. If you see from Gujarat to Bengal, coastal kingdoms. Hello. Coastal kingdoms always had this kind of mostly liberal societies across the world because the door is open. Whereas the continental kingdoms had great richness, perhaps if they had fertile lands, but the position of women and position of other things used to be a bit different from the coastal kingdoms. This is across the world, any part of the world you can see that. So Kadari Mandalam was based on a coastal kingdom, and I have since because of my background, I have used a lot of things from the Kerala history itself. Even when Britishers came to Kerala at that time, they were shocked by they came with Victorian values, and suddenly they were shocked by the kind of morality which had a different definition of morality, where there were Devadasas instead of Devadasis. So why not?
Yes.
So it is. So that kind of things I tried to bring in. So I draw heavily from history, local folklore, Puranas, and other things.
Okay. So this, this matrilinear concept, this concept where women would also be not just agents of their own lives, they would also have a choice about their partners, about their sexuality, about their consorts. That's part of real history. And that's a history which the rest of India really doesn't know. I mean, we would have these one lines telling us Assam is matrilinear and Kerala there are some cultures which are matrilinear, and that's all you got to know. It is because of our interest in women's studies or gender studies that we have learned more about it. But I think a book like yours is bringing that so much into the forefront that we've had an entire culture with our stories, our arts, our sculptures also, where women are so much more free. So do you think that it's the Victorian values which sort of erased this official history?
Victorian values have erased, a lot of inversions have erased. All these things have not erased, I will say, they have overwritten it. So the underlying methods are still there, they have overwritten it. It's not right or wrong, these things happen in history. But the values which we think as Indian now is something which the Europe has thrown out. We are carrying their garbage, if you ask me. Many of the values are last 19th century Victorian era garbage which we are carrying now. Europe has come out of it. Europe, the feminism movement in Europe, all those things have come out of it. It doesn't mean India was the heaven. They had its own problem. Caste system being one, which I deal in most of my books. India had its own problems and India had its own issues. What happened is we retained many of these issues and we imported some also. So we ended up with what we are. It's a big journey. We had a lot of good things. We had a lot of bad things. We kept the bad things and imported the bad things from outside also.
Yeah.
So
It's so problematic, even in terms of cinema, because where we used to have censorship, it's now called certification, but still the codes which are used in film about what should be shown and what is moral and what is immoral, they are so old-fashioned, and then they have nothing to do with the lives of real people in India. So these are ongoing debates. It's very interesting that you bring this up.
Remember the era when two flowers used to kiss?
Yes.
You cannot show kissing on the screen. So one guy will be roaming around in the set with two flowers to rub together to show kissing.
Yeah. Yes.
And this in the land of Kama Sutra. This in the land of Khajuraho and Konark.
I know. Yes.
With a population of 135 crores. The sect. Everything is what you call Divya Garbh, the divine way everyone is born.
So this is becoming a fascinating conversation. I think there are some questions which are coming in, so maybe we should start taking them.
Yeah.
There's a question received here by Savita Tiwari, who's asking, what kind of videos should one watch to develop visual-based writing?
Visual-based writing, watch more films, watch more TV shows, watch OTT. This is visual storytelling, no? Storytelling is constant. The method in which you tell story, that only changes. Novels are very recent. Even though they say we claim Kadambari is the first novel 1300 years back, or the Chinese claim, Japanese claim, the Europeans claim. A lot of them talk about the novel format, prose format, but still it is only 1300 or 400 years or 300 years old. Whereas drama is 2000, 2500 or 3000 years old. Storytelling was there since before language, perhaps. Storytelling could have been done with the caveman's painting, all might have been storytelling. So storytelling remains constant. Storytelling can be learned through different formats. It could be even through what you call puppets. But for visual storytelling, watch films, because that is the method of storytelling of present century. Novels is that of previous century. So of course, that forms the base. But if it has to reach, for an example, if I tell my Asura or other books, they are sold in almost 1.5 million copies. I have sold all my books put together in 14, 15 languages or more than. But my one episode of Chakravarti Ashoka or C.A.K. Ram was watched by 40 crore people, 35 crore people. See the kind of reach you are having. Yes. The message, the philosophy, the story, if you want to tell, the visual media. How many people would have watched the Game of Thrones or the films, the Bahubali, how many crores would have watched? Almost 100 crore people watched, or more than that across the world. So the power of storytelling, visual storytelling, we have to understand that, because we are not living in the era of poets. So poetry is very relevant and is a great art form. We are not living in the era of novelists, though novelist is a great art form. And there are great artists like Tolstoy to Dickens to so many people. We are living in the era of visual storytelling. So no storyteller can move away from that. Either they can write as screenplays or get their books adapted as screenplays through writers who know about this art form. But to reach people, this is the era where we have to leverage the visual storytelling format. That is why we find that many of the great literary works, which are very poetic, they may not translate well into the films because they were written for some other era. It's beautiful poetry, beautiful choice of words. That's why visual storytelling is very important. For developing that, you have to watch films, you have to watch shows, watch good shows. There is a lot of garbage out there. So watch shows and watch selectively a lot of things. A few bad also you should watch to know how not to tell the story. That also is important.
That's also so true.
So earlier, to be a writer, you have to read a lot. Now, to be a writer, you have to not only read a lot, you have to see a lot too.
Yes. So did you go to any script writing training, or when you started writing your TV serials, or you just did it on your own?
Nothing. Nowhere. I'm an engineer by training, engineer and petroleum manager and all those things. I not even learned literature, but I was exposed to the world of stories, and I always wanted to be a storyteller. I learned on the job. I was fortunate for that, because I was called by one Mr. Anirudh Pathak. I am grateful to him, who had done the Devonka Dev Mahadev. He was a producer in what do you call it? TV, Star TV, with one Mr. Nikhil Sinha. He was the producer, Anirudh was the creative producer. They had called me after reading Asura. They initially wanted me to write only about the Ravan's portion, because I had written Asura. But when I started writing, I also learned fast. Then I took over the entire writing process of the initial 100, 130, 140 episodes of setting up the story. Then I moved on to the next, Ashoka to Mahabali, Hanuman. Even thrillers I have written, like in Netflix, there is something called Battle of Saragadi, Sarfroz Saragadi, I had written. So it's totally out of mythology. It's on history. It's about 21 Sikh against Afghans in British India. So it's not that I write only about mythology. I consider myself as a storyteller. Books I have written more on mythology, but shows I have written on various other things. One show which I am setting up is again on the recent wars, the Kargil and other things which I am writing, the war story.
I see. Right.
Films based on that. So I am learning on the job. Even the film, I have completed the first draft of 2 films. Now the announcement should come soon. Bollywood films. That also first time I am writing as a film. And the thing is that Hindi also I learned very recently. I'm not an expert in Hindi. No, it's not my language. So it's a constant learning process. You learn Hindi, you learn screenplay writing, everything is going on together.
Do you still get time to write in your own language, in Malayali?
I write poetry, I write poetry in my language. Because that's the only language I know properly. Malayalam is the only language I can claim to know properly. somewhat properly. All others are like, I know from here and there, English and all, it's still a struggle for me. English, Hindi, I'm learning it. So what happens is Malayalam doesn't pay well, naturally. It's a funny thing is that my English book translated by someone else in Malayalam sells more than my original Malayalam books. So that is the power English has.
I see.
I write originally in Malayalam. I think what is happening is sometimes the good knowledge about language can be a hindrance, is what I found out. Because you tend to use tougher words, you tend to write poetically. So my Malayalam writing will be totally different from my English writing, which I am writing simple, because I don't, my language skills I am still learning, no. So I am able to convey my ideas and the visual ideas in much more simpler fashion, which is the fundamental of good writing. But Malayalam, I forget that, because you are a connoisseur of language, you like the language, so you try to experiment with your language skills and you enjoy writing that. But the reader might not be having that kind of patience to understand what is a language, go back to the dictionary and all. So my lack of English has helped me, I think. Lack of English knowledge has helped me in writing better English, I think. More simpler English.
Faster as well. Yeah. Okay. There is a question for you. Someone asks, how do you choose the women characters to write on for your books? The name's not coming out, but this is the question. How do you choose the women characters?
I have this habit of, I carry the character inside me for a long time. My writing process is very fast, but the, the pregnancy of the idea, that goes on like an elephant, 18 months, 20 months, 30 months, 40 months. So what happens is, if I am writing about a women character, it is a time for 3 or 4 months in my mind they will be living. They are like my friends. They are like, then I observe a lot. What my wife is doing, what my daughter is doing, what my sister is doing, how they talk, how they, without even them knowing, without even I being aware of it, but my brain is observing that. And I try to bring that out in the characters, because there are many people who say it's very difficult for a male to write from female's perspective. But I don't believe in that, because as a writer, you should be able to create. If you are writing, then Walt Disney could not have created, he's not a mouse, no? So he cannot create Mickey Mouse, or he's not a duck for that matter. So it is about how a writer will have to play different roles. So I try to, of course, it's like actor playing the role, no? Actor thinks that he is a character, and then he plays the role according to what he thinks that character will. Same way I'm writing. I think I am Tara in my Vanara book. I am the Tara. So try to think like Tara and write. Maybe if a woman writes that, if a woman writer writes that, it might be different. But that's a limitation I have to play with. I choose but usually I choose all my women characters are strong, maybe because of the background and the family influence which I had, because I come from a family of very strong women. Basically, it's a cultural thing also from Kerala. So I even Sita, when I write in Siya Ke Ram, it's not the Tulsidas Sita, it's more like Valmiki Sita, who is a very strong character.
Yeah, that would be another very interesting debate or discourse, really, about how again during the ages, this whole concept of a very a Sita with agency, a Sita who was almost a warrior, becomes this demure wife who has to stand there next to her Rama and listen to everything that's being told, and also even accept things which are unfair. So this idea that you talked about, the coastal narratives and what is in the hinterland, what is in the landlocked areas, it's very interesting what you're talking about here, because there is more acceptance, I think, in the coasts. And I'm from Bengal. I'm actually from what is now Bangladesh, from East Bengal, from the Chittagong port city, where there was a lot of exchange with other cultures and with the French and with the English and many other cultures which were coming in. So I think that openness to other cultures is something that perhaps, you know, my grandmother was using, talc, body talc, powder, and then the fact that they started wearing the chemise at a time when women didn't wear blouses, but very early they started wearing the inner chemise, which came from France. So it's just very interesting about how these things have come to certain parts of the country, whereas many other bits are still so strongly patriarchal in views. So you're throwing up a lot of interesting questions here.
Our entire Indian history, if you see, we many of the things what they say, India was always colonized, India never attacked. These are all wrong things. India has colonized a lot of countries.
Yeah.
The Gangetic belt had not gone out. But Cholas ruled up to Indonesia, Sumatra, Java. There were colonies of that. There were trade centers across the world of Odias, of Malayalis of those from Odias, from Gujaratis. These traders had colonized Tamilians. These people had colonized from Bengal. Across the world, the Indian history, if you take about 11th century, 12th century and all, Indian merchants like East India Company, Indian merchants were controlling the politics of China and Indochina and all those places. So whatever East India Company did to us, we have done to many others. So the entire narrative that India is a defeatist civilization, whichever Tom, Dick and Harry in the, in the Central Asian plains, whenever they wanted, they could come here and attack and conquer us. We fought bravely, lost all wars. That narrative is not applicable to most part of the country at all.
So true.
Even the talk about 1,000 years of slavery, certain people talk about. Where was 1,000 years of slavery? Many parts of the country, it's 100 years of slavery, perhaps, in the last British rule. Otherwise, it was always free. The Vijayanagara empires and the Travancore and all those things were flourishing up to 1900s. So where is the question of slavery and all those things? Certain parts of the country went, but that doesn't make the entire country like that. So even the narratives have to change. That's why Sanjeev Sanyal in his book had told about that. No, we had to talk, even Amish was talking about it. We had to talk more about the coastal history from Gujarat to Bengal than the central Indian history. Not that it is not important, but we have talked enough of that. If you talk about the expeditions from Gujaratis to Maharashtra,
stories about migration. Yeah, like the whole southeast migration and colonizing and the history, that's not been explored fictionally. Maybe there are stories there which really need to be looked at. Okay, so there is another question. You don many a hat. Joita Bose is asking you. You don many a hat. Which role is the most challenging and which do you enjoy the most?
The most challenging, of course, is writing. If it is a screenplay, it is very difficult to do because it's very technical thing. You have to keep on changing it depending on the budget. Because as I said, it's a plan. It's not the final. Yeah. You're writing novel, okay, this is it. I have to just argue sometime with my editor what to take out because you don't like to take out anything. So with your editor, you will have some small tussle. After that, that's it. Novel is out. But when you are writing screenplay, you have to please 200 people. You have to screenplay is toughest. What I enjoy most, I enjoy writing stories in Malayalam, with which I cannot live. But that is what gives me a lot of happiness. I have not written much in Malayalam, one book and a few stories, some poetry. I enjoy that most, but this is fun. You write in English, reach more people, sell a lot, more people recognize you. That is fun. So that is, one is fun thing, the other one is satisfaction. I think I'm not old enough to settle for satisfaction. Let me have my fun until when I become old, perhaps, then I will shift to my mother tongue and write something for myself. Now I am writing for the world. I have so many stories to tell. So I will write it as novel, I will write it as screenplays, I will write it in Hindi, I will write it in English. One day I may go back to Malayalam and write what I want.
You also mentioned that there was a children's book forthcoming.
Next month it will be. Announcement will be coming soon. Next month it will be coming.
And what is that on? What is it on?
It is about naughty asuras.
Ah, okay.
It's a fun book. It's for 8 to 12-year, 13-year-old kind of fun book kind of thing. It's a lot of humor and I hope everyone will laugh at the appropriate places where I intend them to laugh. But it's a humorous children's book. but not yes.
How about where is the next episode, the next
This
prequel?
90% is over. I'm just waiting for some reaction from the people and to write the next 10%. So December, January it should come. I may submit it by next month. The rest 10% I will finish and submit by next month mid somewhere. September mid I will submit. Then editing and other process, maybe December, January it might come.
So that's interesting. You're actually waiting for feedback on Chaturanga, and then you will finish that. That's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
These are all screenplay. You write it, you wait for the director to come and then you change the scene.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a lot of writing in your hands, Anand, and I think it's time also to bring this session to a close. I'd like to wish you all the best for your future writing, and we look forward to the next sequel. And you delve in and out of the Bahubali prequel, but you're also doing other things. I find that absolutely fascinating. So you have so many worlds in your head, and you're inhabiting one, leaping to the other. It's incredible. So keep up the good work, and we look forward to more writing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. And we have officially launching the book. The Chaturanga.
Yes, see, viewers, the books are behind Anand. The first one on his left, The Rise of Shivagami, was the first one. And the second one, this is the new book called Chaturanga, on the right side, and Anand is indicating. For us Bengalis, Chaturanga is also a very well-known novel by Rabindranath Tagore. So it's so interesting to see that you've used this title here again. And it's a wonderful world where we didn't get to talk really about the whole debate between the throne and honor, between power and honor, that you win some and you lose some. But I'll leave that for the readers to explore, and we will look forward to all your work. Thank you from Prabha Kaitan Foundation. Thank you to the Nehru Center, and all the best to you.
Thank you.
Namaskar.